Have you ever felt like you were screaming inside, but no one was listening? As if your soul is silently asking for help, while you keep smiling so as not to worry anyone? Maybe you are experiencing exactly this right now, trying to be strong, trying to look good, but inside, carrying a silence that weighs on you more than any words. There is a pain that no one sees, a pain that you have learned to hide even from God, and yet this pain speaks. It speaks in the form of sighs, sleepless nights, short answers, subtle withdrawals. You didn't walk away because you wanted to. You walked away because keeping quiet felt safer than being ignored again. Because deep down, there is an old fear, the fear of saying what you feel and once again not being heard. Rumi said, "Even your pain is a prayer." But what if this silent prayer is the only language your soul knows? What if, behind your silence, your most sacred part is hidden? You may not even realize it, but every time you silence what you feel, something inside you dies a little. And yet the world insists on interpreting his silence as coldness, like indifference, as pride. But only you know that behind this silence, there is a soul exhausted from trying, a soul that has already given too much of itself, who has already screamed, cried, exposed himself, and today he just wants to protect himself. You want to hide in the only place where you still feel some peace, your own silence. But does this silence really protect you? Or is it turning into a prison? This is the spiritual truth that almost no one tells you. The heart that carries deep silences. It is the same heart that still has hope, who still believes that someone at some point will see it without you having to explain it. You will understand without needing to translate. You feel this because you carry a sensitive soul within you. A soul that vibrates at frequencies the world does not understand. A soul that communicates more with the invisible than with the obvious. And that is why silence became his language. But what if I told you that silence also makes you sick? Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." But what if you spent so much time silencing your pain that not even the light can enter anymore? What if you turned your own soul into a dark room where no one is allowed to enter? Not even you? Many times we learn to be silent not because we want to, but because at some point when he tried to speak he was not heard. Or worse, he was judged. And since then his soul has been shrinking. He fell silent. He learned that the safest thing to do is to hide. Do not show, not to feel, at least not in front of others. And just like that, without realizing it, you became an expert at looking good, in disguise, in surviving, but never in healing. But now the time has come to listen to what this silence is trying to tell you. Because he speaks, he screams, he begs you to listen to yourself again. There is a spiritual truth hidden within every silence you carry. A key, a revelation, something that can transform your pain into wisdom. But it only reveals itself when you have the courage to look inside. So before you continue, take a breath. In truth, slowly and deeply. This is not just another video. It's a meeting. With yourself, with your pain, with what was kept for too long. And now that you're here, let's get through this silence together. But before we continue, I need to ask you something simple and deeply symbolic. If this silence I'm describing has ever spoken to you at some point, comment below. I carry silences, but today I choose to listen to them. Write this down, not just for me, but as a pact with your own soul. Because when you name what you feel, you begin to free what imprisons you. And if, in some way, this video has already touched you, it felt like a conversation with the deepest part of you, leave your like now. Souls that feel, that seek, that still believe in the silent beauty of healing. And if you want to continue this journey with me, subscribe to the channel Whispers of Rumi. This is a space created for souls who feel deeply, who traverse the invisible, and who are not content with ready-made answers. Here we don't pretend it doesn't hurt. We transform pain into light. We embrace the silence, the confusion, the intensity, and we go through it all together. If you've been feeling that fog after awakening, wondering where your flame went, know this: you're not alone. This channel exists for those who choose to awaken, even when it scares them. Then breathe once more, because what comes next, it's the most invisible part of your pain, and perhaps the most urgent to understand. Have you ever felt like no one really sees you? As if your existence is always a little out of focus, as if you are present, but never really noticed? Sometimes you even try to show yourself. Try to tell what you feel. Try to put into words what is happening inside you. But his words always seem softer than his wounds, lighter than what you actually carry. And deep down, you know why. Because you've learned that the world doesn't know what to do with people who feel too much. He learned that depth is scary, that intensity is astonishing, that silence is safer than rejection. That's why you smile. I smiled to avoid questions. I smiled to look strong. He smiles because he knows that if he showed everything he feels, maybe no one would stay. And then you shut up. And this silence grows, spreading, occupying every corner of your soul like a dense, invisible fog. Have you noticed this? Maybe you've become an expert at looking good. In responding, everything is fine when everything inside you is in ruins. Pretending to be strong when all he wanted was a hug. And that leaves you even more alone, more disconnected, more invisible. Because no one can take care of a pain you've learned to hide so well. And the more you pretend you're okay, the further you move away from the chance of being truly welcomed. This is the invisible problem. The world sees your image, but does not see your soul. People hang out with you, but they don't really connect. You are surrounded, but alone. It is present, but absent from itself. And little by little, you begin to wonder if there is something wrong with you. But it doesn't exist. What exists is a heart that has been taught to be silent, a soul that has been conditioned to hide its wounds. Since you were little, you may have learned that crying was a weakness, that feeling too much was an exaggeration, that expressing oneself was being dramatic. And the pain, which should have been heard, became a secret. It turned into a shadow. It became this silence that accompanies you to this day, this silence that you carry without realizing it, and that shaped you in ways you're still trying to understand. Because silence also forms scars, but they don't appear on the skin. They appear in the way you sabotage yourself, in the difficulty you have in trusting, in constant fear of being abandoned, in the tendency to give too much of yourself, hoping that someone will finally see the real you. And when that doesn't happen, you become even more silent, because talking seems useless. It looks dangerous. You seem too fragile for the world that taught you to survive by swallowing your own pain. The spiritual truth that almost no one tells you is that the silence you carry is not natural. It is learned. He is a protection, a mechanism your soul created to survive in a noisy, insensitive, hurried world. But you weren't born that way. You were born whole, free, sensitive. You were born with a voice, with light, with a pulsating soul. And that is why, even in the midst of silence, there is within you an almost desperate desire to be understood, to be heard without having to explain yourself, to be seen without needing to conform, to be loved for who you are, not for who you pretend to be. But this need, when ignored for too long, becomes a wound. It becomes an invisible hole that nothing seems to fill. It becomes what many call an existential void. Do you feel it? This tiredness that has no name. This desire to disappear just to see if anyone would miss you. This confusion between being strong and being exhausted. You feel it because there is something inside you asking to be rescued. Something that can no longer live in silence. Your soul. And even if you think you're already used to this silence, there is a part of you that still screams inside, that still desires, who still dreams of a place where he can be whole, without fear. A place where silence no longer needs to be armor. Where you can just be. No filters. No masks. Without fear of not fitting. You feel this because you are human. Because it is spiritual. Because it is made of flesh and soul. Of pain and light. Of wounds and truths. And the truth is, you weren't born to hide inside yourself. You were born to awaken, to expand. To be seen. First by you, and then by the world. So, if something inside you identifies with these words, write in the comments, "My soul still longs to be heard," because just by writing this, you already begin to break the cycle of silence. And maybe this will be your first prayer out loud. Silent hearts are not fragile. They are souls that carry the strength of those who have weathered inner storms in absolute silence. Souls that have learned to survive in silence, not out of weakness, but out of protection. Because there comes a moment in life when you realize that speaking, no matter how sincere, doesn't always change things. Sometimes the world hears, but doesn't listen, sees, but doesn't see. And it is in this space between being and not being understood that the most painful silence of all arises, the one that comes from within. You don't keep quiet because you want to. You keep quiet because you've learned that opening your heart doesn't always result in acceptance, because you've tried to explain yourself and been invalidated. You've tried to show yourself and been judged. You've tried to cry out your pain and only received silence in return. And then, little by little, you began to bottle it all up. You swallowed words, emotions, tears. You swallowed desires, truths, wishes. And so you created a sanctuary, an inner temple where only you enter. A dark but sacred place. A place where your soul can still exist in its own way without needing to justify itself. But what happens when this sanctuary starts to become a prison? Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." But what if instead of allowing the light to enter, you began to protect that wound so much that no one else has access to it? Not others, and not you. You close it off. You become silent. You avoid looking. And this silence that was once a refuge begins to suffocate. There's a spiritual root behind this behavior, something deeper than just fear of getting hurt again. It's the soul trying to preserve its last spark of sensitivity. Because in a world so noisy, so superficial, so impatient with the pain of others, being sensitive has become almost a crime. But your soul, even hurt, is still sensitive. It still feels deeply. It still vibrates with the subtle. And to not lose it, this last living part of you, it keeps quiet. Silence in this case is not an end. It's an attempt to remain whole, a way to protect what is still pure within you. But the more you remain silent, the further you are from healing. Because what is not named is not transformed. What is kept hidden in fear becomes shadow, and shadow doesn't disappear. It spreads, infiltrating your relationships, your choices, the way you see the world and yourself. Have you ever found yourself avoiding depth? Avoiding conversations that expose you? Looking away when someone asks how you are? For real? Not because you don't want to be seen, but because you're afraid of being seen too much. Afraid of showing your pain and not being welcomed. Afraid of showing your soul and being rejected. And so you live on this tightrope between the desire to connect and the terror of being hurt again. But this tightrope is actually a reflection of your spiritual history. A history where you were likely taught to adapt to be accepted, to hide your intensity, to conform to expectations. And each time you fell a little short, it was as if you were saying to yourself, "I'm not enough as I am." Until it became true. Until your soul began to believe it. And the soul, when it believes it can't be itself, begins to shut down, to withdraw, to become silent. And you live with less color, less presence, less brilliance. You accept less than you deserve. You shrink into relationships where you're not seen, into jobs where you're not valued, into routines where there's no life. All because, way back when, something inside you decided it was safer to survive than to show off. But spirituality doesn't want you to survive. It wants you to awaken, to reconnect with your essence, to allow the light to enter, even if it's through the wound, even if it hurts at first, because all stored pain turns into weight, and all accumulated weight prevents the soul from soaring. Do you feel this weight? This fatigue that has no apparent cause? This sadness that comes without explanation? Maybe it's not sadness. Maybe it's accumulation of unspoken words, of unfelt emotions, of silenced truths. Maybe it's your soul trying to tell you, "Listen to me." And that's why you're here. Because somewhere inside you, there's still a spark burning, a desire for healing, a call to reconnect with who you truly are, behind all the masks, behind all the silences. This is the spiritual root of your pain, the disconnection from your own soul. The distance between what you feel and what you show. The chasm between who you are and what the world sees. And this chasm, if left unaddressed, continues to grow. It continues to distance you from true relationships, authentic decisions, and a meaningful life. That's why it's so important that you observe yourself, that you allow yourself to feel, that you name what has always been kept in the dark, because only then can you begin to make peace with your truth. Only then can you transform silence into a path, not a prison. And only then can your soul begin to return, to inhabit your body, to pulse with intensity again. Because healing isn't a distant place. Healing is a return, a reunion, a reconnection with everything you tried to bury, but that never ceased to exist within you. If this made sense to you, leave a comment. My wound also wants light. Write this sentence as a whisper from your soul, as a small opening in this silence you carry. Because sometimes, it's in this small gesture, writing what you feel, that healing begins to happen. What no one told you is that there's a hidden wisdom within your pain, a silent key hidden in the deepest layers of what you feel, but haven't yet understood. Your silence, the one you carry as if it were part of who you are, is also a prayer. Only unlike a prayer spoken aloud, this silent prayer doesn't ask. It begs. It begs for relief, for presence, for connection. It begs for a space where your soul can exist unquestioned, unshaped, undenied. And even if you don't realize it, this request echoes within you every day. But there is a spiritual truth that changes everything. Your silence no longer needs to be a prison. It can become a passage, a portal, a beginning. Healing begins precisely the moment you understand that feeling deeply is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of a living soul. It's a sign that there's still something inside you that pulses, that desires, that insists on existing even after being stifled for so long. Pain, however unbearable it may seem, is a reminder that your soul is still here, trying to call you back to yourself. Rumi said, "You were born with wings. Why do you still crawl?" And this question, if heard courageously, breaks the chains you've placed around your being. Because yes, you were born with wings. You were born with a soul not made to fit into forced silences, nor to hide in relationships that diminish your light. You were born to express yourself, to expand, to fly lightly over that which once weighed you down. But flying requires an internal gesture, an invisible movement, surrender. The hidden key to healing isn't fighting the pain. It's not stifling what you feel. It's not forcing a smile when your chest is in pieces. The key is to accept. Accept that it hurts. Accept that you feel. Accept that there's a void. Accept that you're human and at the same time a soul. Accept that there's a sacred process in everything you were trying to escape. Because the truth is, you no longer need to fight to be strong. You just need to stop running from yourself. Resistance is what fuels pain. When you try to erase what you feel, you only push it deeper. And what sinks in doesn't disappear. It stays there, in the unconscious, creating patterns, sabotage, disconnections. It stays there, influencing your choices, your feelings, your fears. It stays there, waiting for one day you'll stop, look, and say, "I see you." This "I see you" needs to be said not to others, but to your pain, to your soul, to everything you buried inside yourself, thinking it was better to forget. And it's at that moment that something begins to change. When you stop hiding from your own truth, healing begins. Not with fireworks, not with certainties, but with silence. A new silence. No longer one of suffocation, but a silence of presence. A silence where you don't need to say anything, and yet you feel like you're being heard. Where you breathe deeper. Where your soul finally feels seen. The curious thing is that sometimes the healing process begins in simple ways. An unexpected cry, an old memory that returns, a conversation that touches you in a different way, a video like this, a text that seems to have been written by your own soul. These moments are not small. They are portals. They are spaces of revelation. They are like cracks where light slowly begins to penetrate. You don't need to rush, but you do need to have courage. Courage to stay with what you feel. Courage to not run away. Courage to not get distracted, because the world offers 1,000 distractions to keep you from facing what's inside. But healing isn't in the world. It's in your presence, in your inward gaze, in your choice to listen to yourself even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. You are not your pain, but it is part of your story. And stories are not erased. They are transformed with acceptance, with compassion, with presence. And when you begin to treat yourself with this spiritual kindness, something within you is reborn. It's subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it's real. It's you coming back to you. Make no mistake, this return requires renunciation. You have to let go of old roles, of old versions of yourself, of old beliefs that said you would only be loved if you were strong, productive, joyful, and impeccable. You no longer need to perform to deserve to exist. Your soul was not made for performances. It was made for communion. And you can, at any moment, choose to return to this communion, with yourself, with what you feel, with who you are. So listen, there's a key in everything you've experienced, even in the hurt, especially in the hurt. There's a revelation in every silence, a sacred request in every tear, a wisdom hidden in the nights that seemed endless. And this wisdom isn't outside. It's there, in your heart, in your soul, in the very spot where you thought there was nothing left. And if you've come this far, it wasn't by chance. Your soul brought you here, because it was ready to hear this truth, ready to remember that healing doesn't come from the strength you pretend to have, but from the courage you have to be true to what you feel, ready to let go of the weight, to stop crawling, to remember that you were born with wings. If you felt that this message spoke directly to what is hidden within you, comment here, "I'm ready to fly with my soul." Write it as a sign of openness, as a pact with yourself. Maybe this sentence will begin to unlock everything that's been trapped inside for so long. Perhaps you're currently in a relationship where everything seems calm, too calm, seemingly stable, seemingly functional, even seemingly mature in the eyes of others. But this calm, which on the outside appears as balance, on the inside suffocates you, because it's not peace, it's absence, a lack of depth, a lack of true exchange, a lack of listening, of looking, of soul. It's the kind of silence that doesn't heal, the kind that becomes a hole between two bodies. You lie next to someone but feel alone. You speak, but feel unheard. And then you stop speaking. You become silent. You retreat. You adapt to the little things, to the lukewarm, to the minimum, just so you don't lose, just so you don't feel completely alone. But what almost no one says is that this way of staying, this bond maintained through swallowed silences, also takes you away from yourself. Because every time you stop expressing your feelings to keep the other person, you abandon yourself. Every time you accept emotional crumbs, believing this is better than nothing, you tell your soul that it doesn't deserve more. And this internal message, even without words, slowly eats away at you. You begin to feel like there's something wrong with you. You begin to doubt your own worth. You begin to think you're asking for too much. That feeling deeply is a mistake, a failing of yours. And then you become even more silent, until silence becomes the only language within the relationship. The most painful thing is that, even so, you remain. You remain out of loyalty to what was once beautiful. You remain in the hope that one day everything will change. You remain because leaving hurts. But for now you feel that talking is no use either. And it is in this in-between space, where there is no true presence but also no courage to break free, that you begin to disappear from yourself. You adapt. You mold yourself. You fit into spaces that were never yours, until one day you wake up and no longer recognize yourself. You no longer know what you like. You no longer know what you need. You no longer know if what you feel is real or exaggerated. You only know that it hurts. This doesn't just happen in romantic relationships. It can happen in friendships, in families, in the workplace. Places where you learn to keep quiet so as not to be excluded, to avoid conflict, to maintain what's already worn out. But the cost is always the same. You, your voice, your soul, your light. The absence of conflict is not peace when there is an absence of connection. The absence of shouting is not emotional health when the silence that prevails is that of disconnection. The spiritual key we spoke about earlier, the one that invites you to heal, applies precisely here. Because this is the time when you can choose differently, not to run away, not to explode, but to listen to yourself, recognize yourself, and begin to name, even if slowly, what's hidden beneath your adaptation. Not to change the other person, not to prove a point, but to reclaim your wholeness, to remember that you exist, that you have a living soul, that feeling too much isn't a mistake, it's a gift, and that you no longer need to fit into spaces that require you to die emotionally just to remain. Maybe you're experiencing something like this right now. Maybe you're in a silent cycle where everyone thinks everything is fine, except you. Maybe you're laughing at parties, attending meetings, responding to messages with emojis and polite words. But inside, you're screaming, and no one sees. No one asks, no one listens. But you know. And because you know, you carry a pain that can no longer be ignored. A pain that doesn't come solely from the absence of the other. It comes, above all, from your own absence, from your distance from your own soul. Maybe you've lost yourself trying to hold on to what no longer finds you. Maybe you're insisting on relationships that no longer see you. Maybe you're keeping quiet to maintain connections, to keep company, to maintain the bare minimum. But now is the time to look at this truthfully, because your soul wasn't made to survive. It was made to flourish. And there's no way to flourish where there's no sun, where there's no water, where there's no space, where everything you are must be reduced to fit. You may think you're overreacting, that you're too sensitive, that it's all in your head, but it's not. What you feel is real, and it's trying to show you something. The soul has subtle and often painful ways of telling us we're betraying ourselves. The silent pain, the constant fatigue, the apathy, the anxiety that appears out of nowhere. All these are symptoms of a stifled, silenced, neglected soul, symptoms of an existence lived automatically, superficially, far from its center, far from what truly makes sense. And I know it's not easy. I know that breaking cycles hurts, that facing your own absence is frightening, but I also know that remaining in what erases you is a slow death, and that there's nothing more sacred than returning to yourself, starting to listen to yourself, starting to embrace yourself, starting to rebuild, even if silently, a space within yourself where your soul can breathe again. You don't need to change everything right now. You don't need to make major revolutions, but you do need to take a step, a small step. Maybe write what you feel, maybe allow a tear, maybe admit to yourself that everything isn't okay, because it's in this small gesture of truth that a new road begins, and this road leads straight inward, to the place you should never have left, your center, your soul, your light. If you saw yourself in this text, if something inside you recognized this story as yours, write here in the comments. I don't want to erase myself to fit in anymore. Leave this phrase as a reminder, a seed of truth, because sometimes all the soul needs to begin healing is to be heard, and you just did that. You are not weak for feeling too much. You're just someone whose soul is too big to fit into small labels, shallow explanations, and lukewarm relationships. You are someone who feels things before you even understand them. Someone who intuits, who perceives, who senses. Someone who sees nuances, who feels the change in tone in the speaker's voice, who notices what was not said, who captures the silence in the middle of the conversation. And that, contrary to what you've been led to believe, is not a problem. It's a gift that requires awareness, presence, and above all, the courage to not remain silent in the face of one's own depth. You've been called intense, complicated, dramatic. Perhaps he was seen as someone difficult to deal with, someone who feels too much, who gives too much, who gets hurt easily. But the truth is that his sensitivity is not excess, it is spiritual precision. It is this ability you have to sense what others don't that makes your presence so rare, and it is exactly this depth that made you learn to protect yourself, because feeling too much, in a world that feels too little, can be devastating. But now it's time to change the story you tell yourself. Rumi said, "Don't be content with stories of how things happen to others. Awaken your own legend." And maybe this sentence was written for you, for that moment, because you've listened too much to other people's pain, you've suppressed yourself too much so as not to bother them, you've lived through stories that weren't yours, but now it is your story that needs to be born. And it doesn't start with noise, euphoria, or a desperate attempt to be seen. It begins in the silence that you finally decide to listen to, in the silence you choose to decipher, rather than repress. The shift in consciousness begins when you understand that your pain no longer needs to be feared. It needs to be deciphered, that the emptiness you feel is not the end, but the space where something new wants to be born. That the loneliness that scares you could be your soul's call saying, "Come back to me." And it is in this return, in this subtle movement of looking inside with honesty, that you begin to access a force that has always been there, dormant, but alive. It's not about being strong in the traditional sense. It's not about resisting, putting up with everything in silence, carrying the world on your shoulders. It's about recognizing that there is a much more powerful force in those who allow themselves to be vulnerable, who admits that he feels, who no longer hides his soul for fear of being judged, who chooses to be whole, even if it costs some bonds, some appearances, some false compliments. You no longer need to hide behind emotional masks. You no longer have to pretend you don't feel it just to maintain an image. Yes, you can be gentle and firm at the same time. You can be silent and still be profound. You can be spiritual without disconnecting from your human pain. True spirituality does not deny pain. She welcomes her. It transforms. It resignifies. And when you start doing that inside yourself, something changes outside. People who didn't see you disappear. People who truly feel you start to appear. Paths that were previously closed open up. Previously impossible cures become accessible. Because life begins to respond with the same energy that you begin to emit. When your soul begins to listen to itself, it changes its frequency. And that's what changes everything. But that change only happens when you stop seeing yourself as broken. You are not a mistake. It's not an exaggeration. It's not a problem to be solved. You are an expanding universe. You are a field of sacred experiences. You are proof that there is beauty even in pain. You are the temple where silence ceased to be emptiness and became presence. This is the moment where you can stop crawling through the stories you've been told. Stop begging for attention, love, affection, recognition. You don't need any more external evidence. You need internal connection with your truth, with your soul, with the wisdom that exists in your tears, in your silences, in the nights you survived alone. You spent too much time trying to fit into what was small, too much time waiting for the other to validate you, too much time holding back for fear of being too much. But now, the invitation is different. The invitation is for you to embrace who you are, with everything you feel, with everything you've lived, with everything you've carried in silence. Because every part of you has a reason. Every scar has a story. Every silence has a hidden map. And if you've come this far, your soul has already begun this awakening. This reunion with the legend itself, with its untold story, the one that starts when you stop adapting and start honoring yourself. If something in you touched this turning point, if you felt like something had unlocked inside, write in the comments, "My soul is ready to tell its own story." Write as if you are leaving a silent testimony of the transformation that is beginning now, because it is with a simple but true phrase that a new life often begins. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has been touched. Maybe a memory, maybe an old wound, maybe just that silent feeling that this message was meant for you. And it was, because your soul recognizes truth when it listens. It knows when something speaks directly to what is hidden, to what has been silenced for so long. If this video made you breathe differently, think differently, feel differently, subscribe to the channel. Here, your pains aren't weaknesses. They're portals. Your scars are nothing to be ashamed of. They are maps of your light. The journey does not end in silence. It begins there. Leave your like if this resonated with you. And it doesn't stop there. The next video is already waiting for you on the screen. Click and continue this dive with your soul. It's ready, and I'm here too, waiting for you there.